It's funny how we tend to think about business knowledge as this thing that's only really relevant if you're like running a giant company or something.
Hmm.
But what I love about the personal MBA is how right from the very first page, it just blows that idea wide open.
Yeah, totally.
It makes this really compelling case that understanding like the core principles of business is incredibly valuable for pretty much anyone, no matter what you're doing or where you are in life.
It's like having this, basic literacy for how value gets created and exchanged in the world. It's kind of like understanding, I don't know, basic economics or psychology. It just informs so much of what we do, even if we're not like actively working in those fields.
Totally.
Whether you're trying to like negotiate a raise at work or understand what your company's actually trying to do strategically, or even just, manage your personal finances better.
Yeah.
These concepts just give you a much clearer lens to look through.
Right. And that is exactly what we are diving deep into today. Forget about the 2-year time commitment and the massive tuition bills. Think of this as your accelerated, no-nonsense crash course into the core insights of Josh Kaufman's The Personal MBA.
Mm-hmm.
And who better to guide us through this than Anna, a professor at University 365, and someone who's really spent a lot of time with this book.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome to the deep dive.
I'm always excited to talk about the personal MBA because it's so aligned with, what we try to do at University 365.
Right?
Just providing really thorough, research-backed, practical education that, empowers people to learn and grow.
Awesome.
Our whole goal is to make these, sometimes kind of complex topics actually accessible and useful right away.
I love it. Okay, so our mission today is pretty straightforward. To extract the most crucial and applicable knowledge from the personal MBA and connect it to, the real world for you, the listener. Think of it as like a shortcut to understanding how businesses actually work and, more importantly, how those principles can benefit you, whether you're leading a team, launching a project, or just want to be more, informed about how the world operates.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to be pulling directly from the book, of course, but also bringing in some of the educational perspectives that drive us here at University 365. So, let's jump right in. What makes the approach in the personal MBA so different? What sets it apart?
Well, I think it really comes from Josh Kaufman's own personal experience. After he graduated, he decided to skip the traditional MBA route, and instead he kind of went on this self-directed learning journey. He spent tons of time in bookstores, basically building his own curriculum before he even started his career at Procter & Gamble.
Wow.
And it just shows, how powerful it can be to really take control of your own learning.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's not just his personal anecdote, right? The book has gotten some pretty serious praise from some really smart people. Like James Clear, the author of Atomic Habits, called it a gold mine of useful ideas. And Jane Parrish from Farnham Street actually said that Kaufman has contributed more to his understanding of business than his own MBA program did.
Yeah.
That's a pretty strong endorsement.
Yeah, it really is. It speaks to just how practical and results-oriented the book is. And, while traditional MBA programs can be great for some people, they're not the only path. And they might not even be the best path for everybody.
Right.
The admissions process is so competitive. And, business schools have an incentive to admit people who are already successful, right?
Yeah.
Because that makes them look good.
Yeah, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
Exactly.
And then there's the huge financial investment you have to consider. I remember reading this analysis by Christian Schrager. He's a Wharton MBA himself. And he actually looked at the net present value, which is basically like the value of future returns in today's dollars.
Right.
Of a top-tier MBA. And he found it was surprisingly negative in some cases.
That makes sense when you factor in, the massive tuition, the higher taxes you often pay in the big cities where those MBA level jobs are, and the opportunity cost of, not investing that time and money somewhere else.
Exactly.
It just makes you think, you think about guys like Charlie Munger. He was Warren Buffett's business partner for years, and he had all this success in business without ever getting a formal business education.
That's right.
Which is, kind of the opposite of Buffett, who had a more traditional path.
Yeah, he went to Columbia Business School.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it just shows that, you don't necessarily need to be in a classroom to gain a deep understanding of business.
Totally. So the personal MBA really offers this alternative, this streamlined approach. He basically boils business down to its essential functions. What are those core components that he identifies as being absolutely fundamental to any business?
So he says that every business, no matter what it is, has to perform 5 essential tasks in order to succeed. And those are value creation, marketing, sales, value delivery, and finance. And it doesn't matter what industry you're in, how big or small your company is, or what you're actually selling. These 5 things are universal. Every business needs them to thrive.
So it's like this interconnected, repeatable cycle. You have to create something of value,
Yeah.
let people know about it, convince them to buy it, get it to them effectively, and then manage the financial side of things to make sure it's all sustainable. If
Exactly.
any one of those links breaks, the whole chain falls apart.
Right. If you're not creating something that people actually want or need, then it's just a hobby.
Yeah,
And even if you have something great, if you can't communicate its value and get people's attention, then it's like it doesn't even exist.
it's invisible.
Right. And without sales, well, you're basically running a charity no matter how good your intentions are.
Right, right.
And then if you can't deliver on what you've promised, you'll lose all the trust you've built. And even if you're successful in the short term, if you don't manage your finances well, it won't last.
It's all connected.
It all starts with that first step, creating value.
So that takes us to this idea of economically valuable skills. Kaufman actually points readers to this resource, personalmba.com, for economically-valuable skills.
Yes.
What's the main idea behind that?
So the idea is that you should be focusing on developing skills and knowledge that directly contribute to those 5 core business functions we just talked about.
Yeah.
Anything that helps you create more value, market better, sell more effectively, deliver more reliably, or manage your finances more soundly is economically valuable.
Got it. And at the heart of creating value is really understanding what the market wants, right? What people are actually looking
Yeah.
for. Which brings us to what he calls the iron law of the market. You can have the most innovative product, the most dedicated team, but if there's no real need or desire for what you're offering out there in the market, you're fighting an uphill battle.
It's so true. It's like that saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. You can create a product, but you can't force people to buy it if they don't want it or need it.
Right, right.
That's why market research is so important. You need to figure out what people actually want and need, and then create something that addresses those needs.
Okay, so how do you evaluate a potential business idea or offering to figure out if it has legs, if it actually has potential in the market? Kaufman gives this handy checklist of things to consider, right?
He does. He suggests looking at things like the value of what you're offering. Like, how much value does it provide to the customer?
Okay.
How good is it at attracting attention?
Right.
How much money are people willing to pay for it?
Makes sense.
How are you going to deliver that value?
Okay.
And is there a real need for it in the market?
So that's kind of the core stuff. But then he goes even deeper.
He does. He also talks about things like the cost of delivering that value,
Uh-huh.
how unique your offer is compared to the competition, how fast you can get to market, the
Okay.
upfront investment required,
Yeah.
whether there's potential for upselling to existing customers.
Right.
And if the demand for what you're offering is evergreen, like, is it a lasting trend or just a fad?
I love that term, evergreen. So he also makes this interesting distinction between what he calls the mercenary rule and the crusader rule. What's the difference there?
Yeah, that's a really important one. The mercenary rule basically says focus on what people will actually pay for. Don't get caught up in your own ideas. Look at the market. What are people spending money on?
Right.
The crusader rule is more about those passion projects where people are so driven by their own enthusiasm that they kind of forget to check if anyone is actually going to buy what they're selling.
Yeah, passion is important, but you have to have a viable business model too.
Exactly. Passion is great for starting, but you need a solid business model to keep things going.
So Kaufman also breaks down the different ways that businesses create value into what he calls 12 standard forms of value. I think this is really helpful for thinking about different business models in a new way. Can you give us a few examples?
Sure. So the most basic one is product, which is like a physical item or a piece of software that you sell for more than it cost you to make.
Right.
Then there's service, where you're basically selling your skills or expertise. Think like consulting or personal training.
Okay.
There's shared resource, which is when you let multiple customers use something you own for a fee. Like, think co-working spaces or those shared commercial kitchens.
Got it.
Subscription is when you offer ongoing access to something for a recurring payment, like Netflix or Spotify.
Uh-huh.
Resale is pretty straightforward. You buy stuff wholesale and sell it retail.
Okay.
A lease is when you grant someone temporary use of an asset for a fee, like renting a car.
Right.
Agency is when you act as a middleman, selling someone else's product or service for a commission, like a real estate agent.
Got it.
Audience aggregation is when you build a community or an audience, and then you sell access to that audience to advertisers.
Okay.
Then there's loan, which is just lending money with the expectation of getting paid back with interest. Option is when you sell someone the right but not the obligation to do something, like a stock option.
Yeah.
Insurance is when you take on a risk for someone in exchange for a premium.
Okay.
And then there's capital, which is when you invest money in a business in exchange for equity.
So those are the 12. That's a really diverse set of ways to create value. And he specifically calls out products as often having really high scalability because they can be like duplicated and multiplied.
That's right. Because unlike providing a service, which is often tied to how much time and effort you can put in, a product can be replicated and distributed to a lot of customers without the cost going up proportionally.
Right, right. Makes sense. He also brings up this interesting concept called the hassle premium.
Yes.
What is that all about?
So the hassle premium is this idea that people are often willing to pay more for something if it saves them time, effort, or frustration.
Okay.
Like, think grocery delivery, furniture that comes pre-assembled, or even just really good tech support.
Yeah, people value their time and convenience.
Exactly. So businesses that can make things easier for their customers can often charge more for their products or services.
That's a great insight. Okay, so you've created something valuable. Now you have to let people know about it. That's where marketing comes in.
Hmm.
What are some of the fundamental principles that Kaufman emphasizes in terms of marketing?
So he starts by saying that the first step is just getting people's attention. If no one knows about your product, it doesn't matter how great it is.
Right.
He also talks about this concept of receptivity, which is all about timing and relevance. Your message is way more likely to resonate if it reaches the right people at the right time when they're actually open to it.
Like when they're actually looking for a solution to the problem you're solving.
Exactly.
Then there's remarkability, which is basically Seth Godin's idea of being noteworthy.
Right.
If your product or service doesn't stand out in some way, it's going to get lost in the noise.
He uses the example of Vibram Five Fingers shoes, those weird toe shoes.
Yeah, I remember those.
They were so different that they naturally attracted attention.
That's a great example. So it's not just about being different. It's about being different in a way that's relevant to your target market.
Exactly. You want to get the attention of the people who are actually likely to be interested in what you're selling.
Right. So he also talks about these different levels of awareness that potential customers might have.
Yes.
Are they totally unaware of the problem that your product solves?
Mm-hmm.
Are they aware of the problem but not the solutions?
Right.
Are they aware of solutions but not your specific product?
Exactly. You need to understand where your customers are in their awareness journey to craft the right message.
Makes sense. He also emphasizes the power of demonstration. Showing your product in action or letting people try it out is often way more effective than just describing it.
He uses this great example of how engineers demonstrated the safety of the Brooklyn Bridge by having elephants walk across it.
That's a classic example.
Mm.
And then there's this idea of qualification, which he illustrates with Progressive Insurance and their approach to providing comparison quotes.
Yeah, so what Progressive does is they actually give you quotes from their competitors alongside their own quote.
Interesting.
So they're essentially helping you qualify yourself as a customer. If you're a good driver, their quote is probably going to be competitive. If not, maybe not.
Right.
It's a way of attracting the right customers and being transparent at the same time.
I like it. Then he talks about addressability, which is basically how easy it is to reach your target market.
Right. He uses the example of the yoga market because there are all these yoga studios and publications and online communities.
Okay.
It's relatively easy to reach people who are interested in yoga.
So it's a pretty addressable market.
Exactly. And all of this is in contrast to what he calls spam, those unsolicited messages that nobody wants.
Yeah.
He argues that building relationships based on permission, where you provide value first and then ask if people want to hear more from you, is a much better approach in the long run.
It's more ethical and it's more sustainable.
Absolutely. And every marketing message should have a clear call to action. Tell people exactly what you want them to do.
Right. Don't leave them guessing. So he even talks about using controversy as a way to get attention.
He does. He actually mentions the personal MBA itself as an example of a book that might be seen as controversial because it challenges traditional thinking.
Interesting.
But ultimately, he says that the most powerful form of marketing is your reputation.
Yeah, your track record.
Exactly. A strong reputation built on delivering real value and positive experiences is what really matters.
Okay, so you've gotten people's attention. They're interested. Now you have to turn that interest into a sale. What are some of the key principles of sales that the personal MBA covers?
So he starts by saying that sales are the lifeblood of any business.
Right. Without sales, you don't have a business.
Exactly. And he introduces this idea called the pricing uncertainty principle, which basically means that customers need a good reason to believe that your price is justified.
Okay.
He uses the example of the Hope Diamond, which is so valuable partly because of its history and its perceived rarity.
So there's more to price than just the cost of goods.
Right. He talks about different pricing methods like cost plus pricing, where
Yeah.
you add a markup to your costs,
Okay.
value comparison pricing, where you compare your product to similar products.
He uses the example of buying a house, right?
Mhm.
Like figuring out what comparable houses are selling for.
Exactly. And then there's discounted cash flow analysis, which is more complex but can be really useful for figuring out the value of a business.
Right. He also talks about how sometimes raising your prices can actually increase demand.
Yeah, it sounds counterintuitive, but it can be true, especially with luxury goods. Like if you're selling a Bentley, a higher price might actually make it more desirable.
Because it makes it seem more exclusive.
Exactly. But he cautions about something called price transition shock, which is when you raise your prices too much too quickly and it alienates your existing customers.
Right, you have to be careful about that. So then he talks about education-based selling.
Yeah, that's a really powerful approach.
So what is it?
It's basically about educating your potential customers about their problem and the possible solutions.
Okay.
The idea is that if you genuinely help them understand their needs, they'll be more likely to trust you and buy from you.
But your offer has to actually be good, or you'll just be educating them to buy from your competitors.
That's true.
He also talks about knowing your BTNA, which is your best alternative to a negotiated agreement.
Right, basically knowing what your other options are if this particular deal falls through.
So you're not desperate.
Exactly. And he discusses the power of exclusivity.
Like when something is hard to get.
Exactly. He uses examples like Kirkland's Signature at Costco and Trader Joe's because they only sell their own brands.
Okay.
It creates a sense of scarcity and makes their products seem more valuable.
Interesting. He also outlines these 3 dimensions of negotiation: setup, structure, and discussion.
Right. And he emphasizes the importance of being prepared before you go into any negotiation.
Okay.
Then he gets into some of the psychological aspects of sales and persuasion,
Like what?
like framing, which is about presenting your offer in a way that makes it seem more attractive,
Okay.
and reciprocation, which is this idea that people feel obligated to return favors, even small ones.
Right.
He also mentions this interesting tactic called damaging admission, where you intentionally reveal a small flaw in your product or service.
Why? Why would you do that?
Because it can actually make you seem more trustworthy, like you're not trying to hide anything.
That's so counterintuitive.
It is, but it can be really effective. And ultimately, he says, selling is all about identifying and removing barriers to purchase.
What does he mean by that?
Any doubts, fears, or unanswered questions that are preventing a potential customer from buying from you.
Okay.
He lists these 5 standard objections that people have. It costs too much, it won't work for me, I can wait, and it's too difficult.
Right.
And he says that you have to proactively address those objections if you want to make the sale.
Got it. And he wraps up the sales section by talking about the importance of reactivation,
Yes,
which is reaching out to your past customer.
exactly. People who have already bought from you are much more likely to buy from you again.
Makes sense. All right, so you've made the sale. Now you have to actually deliver on what you've promised. Let's talk about value delivery and operations.
So Kaufman stresses that the best businesses don't just meet customer expectations, they exceed them.
Right, they go above and beyond.
Exactly. And he talks about the value stream, which is basically the entire sequence of activities involved in getting a product or service to the customer.
Okay.
He also mentions the Toyota production system, which is famous for its focus on continuous improvement and efficiency.
Right, the Japanese are known for their lean manufacturing.
Exactly. And he discusses the trade-offs involved in using intermediaries, like selling your product through a retailer.
Okay.
On the one hand, it can help you reach more customers.
Right.
But on the other hand, you lose some control over the customer experience.
And you introduce counterparty risk, right?
Yeah.
Like the risk that the intermediary will mess things up.
Exactly. He also mentions the expectation effect, which is basically the idea that people are really impressed when you do something unexpected and delightful.
Like when you get a free upgrade on a flight.
Exactly. Or when Zappos offers free upgraded shipping.
Right. Those little touches can make a big difference.
They can. Then he talks about predictability.
Like being reliable.
Exactly. If you're inconsistent or unreliable, it damages your reputation.
Makes sense.
He talks about quality, using Henry Royce's famous quote, strive for perfection in everything you do.
That's a good one.
Then he discusses scale, which is basically your ability to handle growth.
Okay.
And he introduces the concept of force multipliers, which are things that allow you to do more with less effort.
Like using a backhoe instead of a shovel to dig a hole.
Exactly. And finally, he stresses the importance of profit margin, which is basically how much profit you make on each sale.
Right. That's a key indicator of a healthy business.
It is.
All right. We've covered creating value, marketing, sales, and delivery. Now let's get into the numbers. Financial fundamentals. What are the key things to understand here?
He starts by distinguishing between cash and profit.
Okay.
Cash flow is important for day-to-day operations, but profitability is what determines the long-term health of a business.
Right. You can have a lot of cash but still be losing money.
Exactly. Then he gives a quick overview of the income statement, which shows your revenues, expenses, and profit.
Okay.
And the balance sheet, which shows your assets, liabilities, and equity.
Right.
And he points out that both of these statements are based on assumptions, which can sometimes be misleading.
Okay.
Then he introduces financial ratios, which are useful for comparing different businesses or tracking your own business's performance over time.
Okay.
He talks about pricing power, which is basically your ability to raise your prices without losing customers.
Right. That's a good position to be in.
It is. Then he discusses lifetime value, which is the total amount of money you expect to make from a customer over the entire time they do business with you.
So it's not just about the one-time sale.
Right. It's about building long-term relationships.
Okay.
He also defines overhead and stresses the importance of keeping your overhead costs low.
Right. Those are the costs of doing business, like rent and utilities.
Exactly. And he distinguishes between fixed costs, which stay the same regardless of how much you sell, and variable costs, which go up as you sell more.
Okay.
He explains amortization, which is basically how you spread out the cost of a long-term asset over its useful life.
Got it.
He highlights purchasing power, which is your ability to buy things, which is obviously related to how much cash you have on hand.
Right.
He also touches on some basic internal controls like limited authorization and segregation of duties, which are important for preventing fraud.
Makes sense.
Then he gets into some key economic concepts like opportunity cost, which is the value of the next best thing you could be doing with your time or money.
Right.
And the time value of money, which is the idea that money is worth more today than it is in the future.
Right, because you can invest it and earn a return.
Exactly. And compounding, which is the amazing way that returns can generate more returns over time.
Yeah, that's the snowball effect.
Exactly. He also discusses leverage, which is basically using borrowed money to amplify your returns.
Yep.
But he cautions that leverage can also amplify your losses.
Right. It's a double-edged sword.
It is.
Yeah.
He talks about bootstrapping, which is starting and growing a business without taking on outside investment.
That's the DIY approach.
Exactly. Then he explains return on investment, or ROI, which is a way of measuring the profitability of an investment.
Okay.
And finally, he emphasizes the importance of cutting your losses when something isn't working. Don't fall victim to the sunk cost fallacy.
Right. Don't keep throwing good money after bad. So the personal MBA goes beyond just the mechanics of business. It also digs into this idea of understanding ourselves and how we work with other people.
Yes.
Let's start with a section on working with yourself.
All right. So Kaufman starts by saying that taking care of yourself is essential for success in business.
Okay.
You need to meet your basic performance requirements.
Like eating well, sleeping enough, and exercise.
Exactly. He then introduces this concept of perceptual control and reference levels, which is how our brains try to keep our perceptions aligned with our desires. He also talks about the conservation of energy, which is basically our natural tendency to be lazy.
Right. We try to avoid unnecessary effort.
And he explains how deviations from our reference levels can trigger us to take action.
Like if you're hungry, you'll eat.
Exactly. And then he talks about reorganization, which is what happens when we're not sure what the best course of action is. We might just start doing random things.
It's like that feeling of being stuck and not knowing what to do next.
Right. Then he discusses how we can resolve internal conflict by adjusting our expectations or changing our environment.
Okay.
He highlights that humans learn best through experimentation and by storing successful patterns in our memory.
So it's like trial and error.
Exactly. Then he talks about mental simulation, which is our ability to imagine different scenarios and outcomes and how important that is for decision making.
Right.
And he acknowledges that motivation is often driven by emotion rather than logic.
Makes sense.
He mentions social status as a powerful motivator.
Right. We want to be respected and admired by others.
Exactly. And he explains loss aversion, which is the idea that we hate losing things more than we like gaining things,
Okay.
and how that affects our risk tolerance.
So we're more likely to take risks to avoid losses than to achieve gains.
Exactly. He also discusses the threat lockdown response, which is our natural reaction to feeling threatened.
Like fight or flight.
Right. And he gives some tips for calming down when you're feeling overwhelmed.
Okay.
He introduces scope limitation, which is our tendency to focus on the immediate and ignore the bigger picture.
So we get caught up in the details.
Right. And absence blindness, which is our failure to notice things that are missing.
Interesting.
He highlights the power of contrast in shaping our perceptions.
Like how something can seem bigger or smaller depending on what you compare it to.
Exactly. And how scarcity can motivate us to take action.
Like if something is in limited supply, we want it more.
Right. He briefly touches on the importance of novelty in keeping our attention.
Like we get bored easily.
We do. And he distinguishes between procrastination and acrasia.
What's the difference?
Procrastination is just putting things off.
Okay.
Acrasia is knowing what you should do, but not doing it.
So it's more like a willpower issue.
Exactly. Then he introduces monoidealism, which is that state of deep focus or flow.
Right, when you're totally absorbed in what you're doing.
And he talks about the cognitive switching penalty, which is the cost of switching between tasks.
Like it takes time to get back into the flow.
It does. He mentions the 4 methods of completion: deletion, deferral, delegation, and doing.
Oh, okay.
And he emphasizes the importance of creating a guiding structure to help you form good habits.
Right, like a routine or a system.
Exactly. He points out that personal productivity systems can't make decisions for you.
Okay.
You still have to make the choices.
And making a decision, even if it's not the perfect one, is better than staying stuck.
Exactly. He introduces the 5-fold how for connecting your desires to actions, and next action thinking, which is focusing on the very next step you need to take.
Right, breaking things down into smaller, manageable chunks.
He explains the benefits of externalization, which is basically writing things down to get them out of your head,
Okay.
and self-elicitation, which is questioning your own assumptions and plans.
Right, challenging yourself.
He talks about the value of doing thought experiments, including the doomsday scenario.
What's that?
It's basically imagining the worst-case scenario so you can prepare for it.
Okay.
He cautions against the excessive self-regard tendency, which is our tendency to overestimate our own abilities.
Right, we all think we're better than average.
We do. And he highlights the importance of seeking feedback, especially critical feedback.
Yeah, it's hard to get better if you don't know what you're doing wrong.
Exactly.
Hmm.
He explains confirmation bias, which is our tendency to look for information that confirms our existing beliefs.
Right.
And the importance of actively seeking out information that challenges our beliefs. He discusses hindsight bias, which is that I knew it all along feeling.